In Japan, horrific catastrophes aren't anomalies, they're a commonplace fact of reality. They're called Jishin Kaji Taifu, earthquake, fire, typhoon, an ancient trinity of disasters that are so familiar that they're woven into proverbs and schoolyard rhymes. For centuries, Japan and its people have contended with these forces. Along the coast, you can find centuries-old stone markers known as tsunami stones. On them, there's messages carved like, "High dwellings are the peace and harmony of our descendants. Remember the calamity of the great tsunamis. Do not build your homes below this point." And so, over time, the people of Japan have adapted. In recent history, particularly following the great earthquakes of the 20th century like the Kanto quake and the Kobe quake, Japan became a kind of role model for the rest of the world, a place where, if disaster struck, you would be as safe as humanly possible. At midday on March the 11th, 2011, the ground began to shake in the town of Rikuzen Takata. The people there believed that they were ready. Like many other coastal towns along Japan's vulnerable northeastern shoreline, they'd spent decades and a lot of money to build solid defences. Flood walls, breakwaters, evacuation towers, and a row of tall black pine trees planted along the beach. These were known as tsunami forests. If they had a tsunami, it wouldn't stop the water completely, but it would soften the blow and slow the water down. Or at least that was the theory. This earthquake was different. The shaking lasted 6 full minutes. It was more violent than anything anyone had seen in their lifetime. What no one realised at the time was that the quake striking Japan on March the 11th would measure a massive 9.0 on the Richter scale, the strongest ever recorded in the country. Despite their entire infrastructure being built around withstanding earthquakes, bridges twisted, the ground cracked open, walls and sometimes entire buildings collapsed. The quakes came again and again. Just when people thought it was over, another round would begin, more violent than the last. The quake was so powerful that it shifted Japan 4 meters closer to America and tilted the Earth's axis by 6.5 inches. And still, few suspected that the worst was yet to come. At Okawa Elementary School, everything was meant to be safe. Like every other Japanese school, their safety standards bordered on obsessive. In theory, there were manuals for every conceivable emergency, and in theory, every member of staff and child knew exactly what to do. One of the notable landmarks in that area was a massive hill, with the slope rising just meters from the schoolyard. Whilst most of it was quite steep, there was a safe path leading up. It was well known to the children because they'd climbed it during science lessons to tend to a patch of shiitake mushrooms. And so when the earthquake hit, the teachers did what they'd been trained to do. They assembled the children in the schoolyard and began counting heads. They contacted the Board of Education and waited for updates and further instructions. Nobody seemed particularly concerned. Earthquakes happened, and so did tsunami warnings. Nothing serious had ever happened to them before, and they weren't located right on the shoreline. It was cold outside. The snow had begun to fall. Some children were incompletely dressed, having left school in a hurry as instructed. They stood around for a while, waiting to hear what would happen next, but for some reason the evacuation came to a standstill. It was later revealed that the school's disaster manual had detailed instructions for earthquakes, fires, and even epidemics, but when it came to tsunamis, the language was vague. The designated primary evacuation point was the schoolyard itself, which made sense. However, as for a secondary evacuation, the instructions were unclear. Take the children to a vacant land or park, etc. Vacant land could mean anything. The manual didn't mention the hill at all. Unfortunately, this lack of specifics would later prove to be a death sentence. As the teachers debated what would be the best thing to do, some parents arrived to retrieve their children. One even pleaded with teachers, saying, "The radio says a 10-meter wave is coming, run to the hill." She was told to calm down. Most parents, however, stayed away. They trusted the staff. After all, in Japan, school was considered the safest place for a child during a disaster. The teachers would know what to do, and panic would only make things worse. As for the children, some of the older boys had noticed cracks appearing in the ground. They spoke to their teachers, begging them to head for the safety of the hill. "We'll die if we stay here," one of them said, but they were hushed and just told to follow instructions. There's footage from this day, taken by a firefighter as he and his crew tried to warn the town's remaining residents. The camera captures their desperate drive through the empty streets, shouting through the loudspeaker for people to run. "Evacuate immediately, mega tsunami imminent." In the footage, a few figures can still be seen walking the streets, dazed and unaware of what's coming. When the truck finally reaches high ground, the camera swings back. Below, the town is already vanishing, swallowed by the tsunami. The tsunami wasn't a wave in the way that most people imagine. It was more like a wall of wreckage, brown and black with soil and timber, filled with uprooted pine trunks, smashed houses and overturned cars. The very tsunami forest that they'd planted to soften the blow had been ripped from the ground and turned into a battering ram, crushing everything in its path. In places like Iwate, the wave reached over 130 feet in height. It moved slowly enough to see, but fast enough that nobody could outrun it. As it funneled between buildings, it rose higher and gathered even more momentum. Survivors would later describe the sound, an enormous roar mixed with a deep, groaning, crunching noise, the sound of concrete, wood and steel being pulverised, the sound of everything they'd ever built, torn apart and now moving towards them. Meanwhile, the teachers gathered in the schoolyard still hadn't decided what to do next. They'd seen a truck speeding past and heard the warning blaring from its loudspeakers, urging them to run, but when they finally made their decision, it was much too late. What's worse is that rather than sending the children up the hill, which was barely a stone's throw behind them, the teachers pointed them towards the road. Most likely they were aiming for the raised traffic island nearby, thinking that it might offer some sort of safety. The older students sprinted ahead, and then something happened. The children in front turned around. They were running back now, terrified, pushing past the slower ones who stood there in confusion. There was no time for them to explain, no time to warn anyone of what they'd just seen around the corner. A black wall of wreckage and muddy water closing in fast. Seconds later, the tsunami reached them all. Just a handful of people managed to reach the safety of the hill before the wave engulfed them. There were 78 children at school that day, and only 4 survived, along with 1 teacher. What happened at Okawa was not unique. Up and down Japan's northeastern coast, entire towns simply vanished. In Sendai, a wave over 10 meters high surged 6 miles inland, funneled by rivers, bringing a trail of destruction deep into the countryside. Roads, bridges, airports, all gone. Entire neighbourhoods turned into lakes of black water littered with splintered rooftops and overturned cars. More than 2,000 kilometres of coastline suffered the same fate. Most of the dead were not killed by drowning. They were crushed, battered or suffocated beneath debris. According to official sources, more than half of the 20,000 victims were elderly. Some corpses were found clinging to fences and telephone poles, overtaken by the tsunami before they could climb any higher. Thousands of bodies were simply never found. The northeastern coast of Japan had been obliterated. The tsunami of 2011 was the worst disaster to strike the country since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In terms of financial cost, it became the most expensive natural disaster in history, with damages estimated at over $235 billion. As if that destruction wasn't bad enough, the tsunami left behind another catastrophe waiting to unfold. In Fukushima Prefecture, the seawater breached the defences of the Daiichi nuclear power plant. Backup generators were drowned, cooling systems failed, and within days, 3 reactors had begun to melt down. In the end, the Fukushima disaster ranked alongside Chernobyl on the international scale of nuclear accidents. Fields were poisoned, towns were evacuated, entire communities were forced to leave behind their homes. But this isn't a story about radiation, it's a story about water and what was left behind when it receded. When the sea finally withdrew, it revealed a landscape that was totally alien. Piles of wreckage still smouldering, tons of foul-smelling mud stretching for miles. The fields were littered with splintered timber and the crumpled remains of cars. Entire neighbourhoods had been flattened. A smell of salt water, smoke and decay hung over the entire landscape. Tens of thousands of people were missing. At Okawa Elementary School, the search began immediately. Parents dug through the wreckage with their bare hands. They were searching for anything that might give them a clue: a school bag, a shoe, even a hair clip, anything that could explain where their children had gone. Some returned to the riverbanks day after day, digging in the mud for weeks, and then months. Some of them would search for years without ever finding a trace of their missing child. Many simply couldn't be found. The mud had buried them too deep, or the waves had dragged them away as it receded back into the ocean. The families understood this, but what they couldn't understand was how it could happen. Why had that school in particular failed so badly to save the students? Later, the parents would gather at the courthouse carrying photographs of their lost children and hand-painted banners that read, "We did what our teachers told us." The psychological toll was impossible to measure. Many people took their own lives. Others simply withdrew, stopped speaking and participating in the world around them. In the months that followed, rates of depression and PTSD soared. Counsellors called it disaster syndrome. And then there was something else, something harder to explain. The tsunami had taken thousands of lives, and now it seemed that some of them had started to come back. A figure seen walking late at night, clothes dripping wet despite there being no rain at all. Somebody knocking at the door in the middle of the night. Voices calling from empty and abandoned streets. In a place like Japan, a place steeped in folklore, these sorts of stories weren't too unusual, but it was the sheer scale of them that was unprecedented. Richard Lloyd Parry is a foreign correspondent who lived in Japan for years. He wrote a book named Ghosts of the Tsunami. In it, he recounts hundreds of uncanny experiences. One common report was people seeing loved ones that they'd lost in the tsunami reflected in water. One woman claimed to have seen the face of her sister reflected in a puddle. Others spoke of seeing eyes or even full figures reflected in water, but when they turned around, nobody was there. There's also a lot of stories of soaked children and adults appearing on doorsteps. Sometimes they would ask for dry clothes, but by the time anyone returned, the person had vanished, leaving behind a puddle of water where they'd been standing. In the city of Ishinomaki, where more than 6,000 people died, residents reported seeing neighbours, people that they knew had died in the tsunami, appearing in their homes and sitting down in puddles of water. Then there's the taxi drivers. At first, they only spoke about it among themselves. They told tales of soaking wet passengers who got into their taxi and then gave an address for a place that no longer existed. According to their accounts, the passenger would disappear from the back seat without a sound. The drivers would log the fares and pay them out of pocket. After all, many of them had lost loved ones in the tsunami too. If the dead need to ride again, one said, I'd welcome them. So what were these sightings? Nobody knew exactly, but they were interesting enough to need to be studied. Yuka Kudo, a sociology student, investigated these stories as part of her graduation thesis. She interviewed over 100 taxi drivers working in the tsunami-hit areas. Some refused to speak to her, others laughed off her questions, but 7 of them shared stories that they couldn't explain. One driver said that he'd picked up a woman near Ishinomaki station. This was just a few months after the disaster. She wore a heavy coat, even though it was warm outside. Take me to Minamihama, she said, which struck him as strange because everyone knew that that entire district had been wiped off the map by the tsunami. The driver gently explained that that neighbourhood no longer existed. After a long pause, the woman said, "Have I died?" When he turned to look at her, the back seat was empty. Another driver recalled picking up a man who said nothing at first. He just silently pointed ahead. After a while, he spoke a single word, Hiyoriyama, the name of a local hill where many had fled for safety during the tsunami. When he reached the summit of that hill, the driver turned to speak to him, but again, the back seat was completely empty. In every case, the drivers had started their meters and the journeys were recorded. The reports didn't end with the drivers. Across Tohoku, many people saw spectral figures wandering through streets where there were no buildings anymore. Sometimes they were even seen queuing outside shops that no longer existed. In Onagawa, it's been said that there's a ghost of an old woman who visits a refugee centre, quietly joining her former neighbours for a cup of tea. This didn't just happen one time, they saw her over and over again. However, nobody ever saw her arrive. Each time she would just be sitting there, and then she would leave, and the cushion where she'd been sitting would be soaked through with seawater. The other people at the centre quickly figured out that she died in the tsunami, but nobody had the heart to tell her. Sociologists catalogued hundreds of these encounters. In many cases, the witnesses commented on the unsettling, calm quietness of the encounter. They said that there was a sense of sadness to it. The ghosts of the tsunami weren't violent or scary, they just seemed lost. Some believed that these spirits remained because their deaths had been so sudden that they didn't know how to leave, or even that they were dead at all. Many of those who died that day didn't even have time to comprehend what was happening. There were stories of people seen standing calmly as the wave approached, unable to accept what was happening was real. In Shinto belief, these spirits are known as yurei, souls that are unable to move on, condemned to wander the earth until the proper rites are performed. In Buddhism, the dead become Hotoki-sama, souls on their way to becoming Buddhas, but only if they are remembered and cared for through ritual and prayer. In this context, the tsunami of 2011 had breached the underworld and shattered the path of the dead. Entire households were swept away, not just the people and their homes, but the altars where ancestors were honoured. Tablets that bore the names of the dead were destroyed, and the dead, some believed, remained behind. One priest called it orphanhood in reverse. The ancestors had lost their descendants. And so, not long after the water receded, priests, Buddhist, Christian, Shinto, began receiving calls for exorcisms, sometimes daily. At first, the calls came from families, and then they started to come from hospitals and eventually even from government facilities. In the aftermath of the tsunami, many people found ways of connecting with those that they'd lost. A widow living alone in a temporary shelter would speak aloud to her husband each night as if he was there. Others would speak to the sea. In the hills of Iwate, someone built a phone booth. Inside it was an old rotary phone that didn't connect to any outside line. Survivors of the tsunami would step inside, lift the receiver, and speak to the dead. They called it the phone of the wind. Over time, it's become a place of pilgrimage for those who've struggled to process their loss. And perhaps for many survivors, ghosts were less frightening than the void left behind by those that had gone. To some, the ghosts of the tsunami are nothing more than that: trauma-induced hallucinations, ghosts shaped by cultural belief, and the overwhelming psychological toll of the disaster. But there's so many of these reports, and many from credible witnesses, that it's hard to explain them all away. Whatever the truth, whether it's psychological or supernatural, the tsunami left something behind that can't easily be put to rest. So, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you found it interesting. I find the taxi driver stories particularly interesting because they really closely mirror the story of the phantom hitchhiker. This is a really common ghost story that's been reported multiple times all over the world. Somebody stops to pick up a hitchhiker or a taxi driver picking up a passenger, and then somewhere along the journey they look in the rearview mirror to the passenger in the back seat and there's nobody there. They turn around, the seat's completely empty. They didn't stop at any point. They never saw the passenger get out of the car. It's an extremely common story. I could probably do a whole video on the phantom hitchhiker phenomena. Anyway, thank you to the patrons for supporting my work. Much appreciated. If you're new here, then check out my channel. I've got loads of content on there. I've been making these videos for years, so there's definitely be something else that'll take your interest. Okay, until next time, goodbye.